From Santa Barbara, California, the Timeless Voyager series, where the knowledge is timeless and you are the Voyager. Interviews with leading-edge authors and speakers, psychic phenomena and the unexplained, UFOs, extraterrestrial encounters, government cover-ups, alternative healthcare, new technologies. Fasten your cosmic seatbelts and join me, your host, Bruce Stephen Holmes, the Timeless Voyager.
Hello everyone, this is Bruce Stephen Holmes, the Timeless Voyager, and I'm here today with Robert Lawrence, a student of the Urantia Book. For those of you who are listening, Urantia is spelled U-R-A-N-T-I-A, and those of you who may remember a show I had a few weeks ago on the air with me that day, Barry Bedell, who explained to us that the word Urantia is actually the name of this planet that we live on, and the book, the Urantia Book, is a book divided into 4 parts, and as a matter of fact, I should probably tell those of you, the part 1 is about the central and super universes, part 2 is about the local universe, part 3 is the history of Urantia, and part 4 is the life and teachings of Jesus, the story of the Son of God and the Son of Man. As I said before, I have with me today Robert Lawrence, and you're not only a student of the book of Urantia, but you specifically devoted a lot of your focus to part 4. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Robert, how did you first come across this Urantia book?
Pretty much the same way that everyone comes across it, and that is that it was given to me by a friend about 15 years ago. And this is an old friend of mine I went to junior high school with, and we've been close all of our lives. And he handed me this big, thick blue book and told me to read this. And I said, "What for?" And he said, "Just trust me and read it." And that began my study of the book.
So you actually read all 2,000, what was the number?
2,097 pages.
2,097 pages.
Oh, yes, more than once.
Okay, so the kind of person that reads a book that's 2,097 pages long is definitely a special individual in the first place.
Not really when you consider the fact that it happened over a 15-year period. In other words, the Urantia book is not like a novel in the sense that you would sit down and read it cover to cover. It's much too complex and too much of a mental exercise. It can be done, and people have done it, but at the time I was first introduced to it, I wasn't as enthusiastic about it as I am now, and I would read a little bit and then put it on my shelf for weeks or months, and then pick it up and read it a little bit more, and so I didn't really get interested in it in a full-time sense, in the meaning that I referred to it or read it on an almost daily or weekly basis until much later.
So let's talk a little bit about the life and teachings of Jesus. The New Testament, should we use the King James Version? That seems to be the most widely used.
Most traditional version, yes.
The account of Jesus' life, according to the Bible, is really not that much, is it?
Approximately 29 days out of the life of Jesus are mentioned in the New Testament. That's accounting for the repetitious accounts of the same event in the various Gospels. You know, each Gospel is in itself a story of the life of Jesus. And when you take into consideration the accounts of the same events that are related in the various Gospels, biblical scholars agree that there are roughly 29 or 30 days, separate days, that are mentioned out of his entire life.
What would be your opinion on why it's like that in the first place? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yes, my opinion, and let me preface all of my remarks by saying that my opinions are based largely upon what I've learned from the Urantia book. And whenever I make a statement that sounds as though I'm making a statement of fact, what I'm saying is what the Urantia book has taught me, which I have since come to believe. And relative to your question, one of the reasons why the account of the life of Jesus is so sketchy in the New Testament is because he forbade his apostles from keeping written records during his lifetime. And presumably because of the problem that people have with written religious records. You know, they become crystallized, they become etched in stone, so to speak, and then later misinterpreted and applied to situations which might not be current and so forth. And he felt it would be better if people learned the essence of the religion of Jesus from other people than to have it written down somewhere and then translated and reinterpreted and altered and edited and for generations to come. And so his apostles didn't actually write anything down on paper until about 40 years after he was gone, when the Gospel of Mark was written, the first of the four Gospels.
So would that put most of them in their 70s and 60s and 70s, perhaps?
Yeah. The Gospel of Mark is reported to have been written about 68, I believe 68 A.D., which would have been roughly 35, 40 years after the death of Christ. And so that was the first. And actually the Gospel, according to Mark, is the Gospel according to Peter, because it was written by a young boy by the name of John Mark, who was a young boy at the time of Jesus.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll bet a lot of these apostles then were very young. They were probably more...
Oh, yeah.
More in the age of college age, let's
20s,
say.
you know,
Early
and
20s,
and
yeah.
30s. The Urantia Book, by the way, contains a great deal of information about the apostles, who they were, their characteristics, their families, tremendous amount of information. And
why don't we be specific?
Huh?
Why don't we be specific?
Okay.
Take one of the apostles, and why don't you just give us a little rundown?
Well, let me point at something else first. It's very interesting as to how the Urantia Book can be useful to a person who is a biblical scholar or someone who is raised in the church. Now, I'm a Baptist by my upbringing, and more specifically, the son of a Baptist minister. And so I was raised on the Bible and in the church. And I went to school at Baylor University, which is a Baptist university, and took some Bible courses there too. So I was very familiar with the Bible long before I discovered the Urantia Book. And so one of my primary interests after discovering the Urantia Book, and specifically Part 4 of the Urantia Book, which deals with the life of Jesus, was the comparison of the two sources, and to see how they complemented or contradicted each other, whichever the case might be. And a few years ago, that task was greatly facilitated by a gentleman who now lives in Malibu. His name is Professor Dwayne Fall, and he was a law professor at Pepperdine University before his retirement, and he spent about 6 years meticulously cross-referencing the entire Bible with the entire Urantia Book, so that a person who is interested in comparing the two and studying both books can readily cross-reference anything that's mentioned in the Bible. You can cross-reference that to any possible mention of it in the Urantia Book and vice versa. And so in the course of teaching a class a while back at a local church on the life and teachings of Jesus as based on the Urantia Book, we studied some specific questions that we wanted to try to shed some light on. And one of these was, who were the 12 apostles? Because you may not be aware of it, but in the Bible there are different lists, 3 different lists of who the 12 apostles were. And biblical scholars have always had a problem with this, but they tend to dismiss it by saying that, well, this guy, this name, and this name are actually the same guy, because they have no other explanation for it. And for example, in the book of Mark, it lists the apostles. That's verse 3:16 through 19. Mark 3:16 through 19 for people that want to look this up. And it lists the apostles as Simon, Andrew, James Zebedee, John Zebedee, Philip, Bartholomew, remember Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot. Now, on that list, there are 2 names, Bartholomew and Thaddeus, which don't
we don't hear those that often.
Which don't jive with the other accounts. Now, in the book of Matthew, for example, that's chapter 10, verses 2 through 4, Bartholomew is on that list, but there's no Thaddeus. In the place of Thaddeus is the name Lebbaeus, or these are Greek names, and I'm not too good at pronouncing them. And so you move on to Luke, chapter 6, verse 14 through 16, and you find no Lebbeus, you find Judas Alphaeus in that slot.
So
And then
there's two Judases in this list.
Yes, Judas Alphaeus and Judas Iscariot are
Right.
two different individuals. And so that's in Luke, you find the two Judases. Now you go over to John, and there is no list per se, but throughout the course of the book of John, he mentions about 9 of the 12 apostles. And in that list, or in that mention, he refers to Nathanael as being one of the apostles, who doesn't appear at all on the other 3 lists. And then also, he mentions Judas as Judas, not Iscariot. You know, he qualifies it by mentioning Judas, comma, not Iscariot, to make the distinction between the two. And so we've got a question here: is who is Thaddeus, who is Lebbeus, who is Judas Alphaeus, and who is Bartholomew, and who is Nathanael, and who was the real apostle? You know, it's kind of like a what's my line thing or something.
Right.
And so this question always fascinated me, and I was happy to discover in the Urantia book that there was an answer to that, a very logical answer that made a lot of sense. First of all, in regard to Thaddeus and Lebbeus and Judas Alphaeus, they're all related in the sense that James Alphaeus, who is on all of the lists, is the brother of Judas Alphaeus. So you got James and Judas Alphaeus. Now, they also went by the names Thaddeus and Lebbeus, which were the Greek names for James and Judas Alphaeus. And
So these are the same two people.
Yeah, James is the same as Thaddeus, and Judas Alphaeus is the same as Lebbeus, or Lebbeus, or however you pronounce it. And so in the case of Mark, he's got James Alphaeus and Thaddeus listed. He's got the same guy on there twice, in other words,
Okay.
to the exclusion of Judas Alphaeus, or Lebbeus, James's brother. Now you go over to Matthew, you've got James Alphaeus, which is correct, and Lebbeus, which is correct. It's the Greek name for his brother and the Hebrew name for him. So you go over to Luke, you've got James Alphaeus and Judas Alphaeus, their Hebrew names, which is correct. And then you get over to John, and there's a mention of Judas, not Iscariot. And so that's readily explainable. You know, they're the same guys. Now, the interesting part comes in with Bartholomew, though. Why is Bartholomew on the first 3 lists, and Nathanael is on John's list, or in John's book, and is not mentioned in the others? And that was the most interesting discovery that we made. And this had to do with the fact that, in fact, Nathanael was the apostle as opposed to Bartholomew. And what had happened was that Nathanael, being one of the 12, came into a falling out with Peter after the death of Christ, because of the fact that after the death of Christ, the apostles, and Peter was pretty much the leader of them, and he became what would be the first pope of the Christian church, in a sense. And Peter and most of the other apostles were inclined to start preaching about Jesus, this new religion which came to be known as Christianity, which is about the life of Jesus and about the more spectacular events in his life, the miracles and the crucifixion and resurrection. This is not what Jesus taught. Jesus taught the gospel of the kingdom, the Brotherhood of Man and the fatherhood of God and the Beatitudes. And so, in the opinion of Nathanael, the apostles should have continued to teach what Jesus taught after his death. They should continue to teach the religion of Jesus rather than teach this new religion about Jesus. And it got to the point to where he finally just gave up and walked out. And so Nathanael left the apostles and went off to do his own thing, so to speak. Now, some 40 years later, whenever John Mark is writing the first gospel, the gospel according to Mark, which was in fact the gospel according to Peter, because John Mark was Peter's protege, and all of the information that John Mark had essentially came from Peter. So you're getting Peter's version of the story in Mark, the first gospel. Now, at that time, whenever they were making up their list of the 12 apostles, some 30, 40 years later, Peter was apparently not disposed to include Nathanael on this list of future saints, so to speak, because of the fact that he walked out on them 30 years ago and they hadn't heard from him since. He was a quitter, as far as Peter was concerned. He had a falling out with the main man and left, and Peter wasn't inclined to put him on the list of the apostles for posterity. And so who did he put on his place? Nathanael's father, Bartholomew, who Peter warmly regarded. He was an early Christian as well, and was a good friend of Peter's. And so when Peter decided to scratch Nathanael from the list, he had to put somebody on there because everybody knew there was 12 apostles.
Right.
So he put Bartholomew on in his place, and to this day, the first three Gospels list him. By the way, the second Gospel, Matthew, and the third one, Luke, were written with Mark in hand as a reference. And so everybody just kind of went along with Peter's list until John came along about 30 more years later at the turn of the century. The Apostle John was one of the 12 himself, and so he knew who the 12 were. And being the forgiving guy that he is, they call him the Apostle of Love, he put Nathanael back on the list because he knew that that's where he belonged. And so that's why Nathanael appears in John's account of who the apostles were. But there's little questions like that and little contradictions or things that seem inexplicable. A lot of light can be shed on them by using the Urantia version of it.
We should talk a little bit about how the Urantia book came into being. Let's just devote a few minutes to it. Would you like to explain that to the audience?
Well, the first thing to point out in that regard is that nobody really knows that. Anything that I say is speculation and apocryphal tales, and it's interesting to note that there is a reason for that. One of the things that man has a tendency to do is really a time-honored tradition of mankind, and that is to exalt the teachers of divine truth while ignoring the teachings. In other words, somebody comes along and tells us something really marvelous, and so we build a statue and worship him and don't pay any attention to what he told us. And the revelators, in the case of the Urantia book, wanted to avoid the development of a cult or the development of some kind of hero worship associated with the origin of the Urantia book. And so all of the information regarding where it actually came here from, how it got on the planet, how it came into being, is a secret which 5 individuals took to their grave with them several years ago. The papers have been around since the 30s, and the book was originally published in 1955. So no one knows for sure exactly how this revelation, which purports to be of extraterrestrial origin, made the transition from out there to this book that you have in your hand. And I hesitate to use the term channeling because it has so many different meanings to so many different people, but in a sense, by definition, that's the most accurate way to describe how it came into existence.
So the story basically is that an anonymous person channeled this supposed extraterrestrial information for a particular amount of time, presented it to a group of people who later published it. Is that correct?
Well, no, actually, it's somewhat different from that.
Okay.
I'll tell you one of the apocryphal tales which seems to have the most credibility of all those that I've heard and discussed with other students of the Urantia book. But it involved a gentleman in Chicago who had no background in the area of science and religion and philosophy and geology and anthropology and cosmology and all of the things that are in this book. And he purportedly was making strange sounds, acting strange in his sleep. And his wife approached a well-known Chicago psychiatrist by the name of Dr. William Sadler, who in some circles has been referred to as the father of American psychiatry, a very well-established physician. And he began to observe this gentleman whenever one of these events would occur, and could not put his finger on what was happening. And at one point in time, though, he decided to actually try to talk to him when he was in one of these states. And so he asked him a question. He said, "Who are you?" And the response was, "I'm a student visitor." And that began the dialogue, which eventually became the Urantia Papers, 196 papers. But the course those papers took was based on a group of individuals which Dr. Sadler then assembled over a period of time. Other physicians, friends of his, persons in academic circles. At one time, the group grew to, I believe, about 70 individuals. And they would get together and formulate questions, which they would then present. And this gentleman, without any consciousness or apparent knowledge of what was going on, would provide the answers, which later became the Urantia Papers. And it took place over a period of several years. It wasn't a...
So this was actually happening during the height of Edgar Cayce, who was well known as a sleeping prophet, so to speak.
From the mid-20s to about 1934 is whenever the Urantia Papers were complete, in as much as they reached the form that they're in now.
All right, that's very interesting. Let's then come back to Michael of Nebadon. Tell me, what does that mean? Well, first of all, where is Nebadon?
Nebadon is the local universe which we are a part of. The Urantia Book contains a great deal of cosmology in that it describes the structure of the universe, the entire master universe, and also the hierarchy of the kingdom of heaven, if you will. And Nebadon is a local universe of 10 million inhabitable planets. And ours is one of those 10 million. And the local universe is broken down into constellations. And constellations are broken down into systems, and systems contain planets. And so Michael of Nebadon is the supreme ruler, the sovereign of this local universe of 10 million planets. And Michael of Nebadon is also known on this planet as Jesus of Nazareth, or more specifically, Joshua ben Joseph, which was his true name. Jesus is a Greek nickname for Joshua.
All right. So let's play devil's advocate here, and incidentally, the devil is three different people too. We talked about that on the last show, but let's hit this thing square, just the way the fundamentalists would hit it. Is Jesus the Son of God then?
More correctly, a Son of God.
And then who is Michael? Who is this guy? I mean, is he between God and
No, there's a
Jesus?
No, Michael is Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth is the mortal incarnation of Michael. He was here on a bestowal mission. If I can back up a little bit, in being the sovereign, or what they call the creator son of the local universe, in effect, Michael of Nebadon is the person who is responsible for the development of this particular universe.
Now, the fundamentalists are going crazy at this point.
Of course they are.
Right, because, I mean, what we know from the Bible is that there is God, there is Jesus, and there is us, and anything else.
Yeah, well, that's somewhat self-serving in that it gives us a lot more importance, than reality, in the sense that it makes us feel important to think that God only has one Son, and we got him, and that we're the only children of God, the only planet in all the vast universe that has will creatures like us on it. And but that's a somewhat naive view that was developed a couple thousand years ago, when we didn't have telescopes, when we didn't have astronomers, when we didn't have scientists, a long time before we knew what we know now relative to the scope of the universe and its makeup and so forth. And you've got to remember that the people that formulated these early stories were not formulating them inaccurately, deliberately, or out of some kind of sinister purpose, but they just told us what they knew. For example, if you were going to be a doctor today, you wouldn't be studying a medical text from the 18th or 19th century, because almost everything in there has since been discarded in favor of new scientific knowledge, which is either more accurate or more relevant. And religion is much the same, in that you have to constantly be open to new revelation. Jesus himself at Pentecost told us that he was going to, or the Father was going to visit upon us a new counselor called the Spirit of Truth, that whereby that all mankind from that point forward would have the capacity to know the truth when they see it or hear it, without anybody else having to tell you that, well, this is true and this is not, this is sacred and this is not.
Now, do people interpret that already as the second coming of Jesus?
Not really.
Or is that different from the second coming?
Because this happened at Pentecost. That's what Pentecost is about, the indwelling of the Spirit of truth. And see, at that point...
So would we call that enlightenment?
In a sense, but you have to consider that after the crucifixion, and even after the resurrection, after Jesus had departed, his apostles were pretty bummed out, because they were heavily dependent upon him. He was their master, and all of a sudden he was gone. And here they were left with the responsibility of carrying on his work.
Now, hadn't they had this experience, though, that Jesus taught?
Well, they had the experience of traveling with him and learning from him.
But I mean the experience of the Pentecostal experience.
Well, not yet. I'm getting up to that.
Okay.
See, the point, what happened was that after he had left them, they were all gathered together, and then the Spirit of truth came upon them, and at that point they became overjoyed, filled with enthusiasm and confidence, because at that point they had a grasp of the truth, and they knew from that point forward that the words would always be there anytime they had the opportunity or the forum. And the Spirit of truth was provided for us for the very specific purpose of being able to discern for yourself what the truth is. And in other words, you don't need another individual to tell you what's true and what's not. You have that capacity, and God provided it himself. And there would have been no need for him to do that if truth was not going to be a continuing process, if its unfoldment was not going to be a continuing process. And so even today, it's foolish in my mind to think that God cut us off whenever Jesus left the planet, that he no longer had any desire or need to communicate with us, and that this is all you're going to know from me. Sorry, he's going to sign off, and that's the end of it. I'm gone. From now on, it's up to you. And the fact is that revelation is an ongoing thing. It's a continuous unfoldment. And if you're not open to that, if you're not looking for it, and if you're not listening, then you'll miss out on it.
All right, so let's back up now. So we're talking about Michael of Nebadon, who is the sovereign ruler. He's what's left of the chaos that occurred when Lucifer, Satan, and Caligastia had their coup. Why don't you refresh our memory on that just for a moment?
Michael is, as I say, the sovereign of the universe, and this rebellion that you're referring to, which was known as the Lucifer Rebellion, which was the precursor of our devil myths.
Right, and we see this in the Bible too.
Sure.
But we only see, 2 verses? Or
Yeah, there's a lot of little clues. That's where the paramony comes in handy.
Yeah.
There's a lot of little clues that are dropped in the Bible that whenever you have read the Urantia Book account, then all of a sudden you can see the verification in the scriptures that, so they do jive. It's just that this is one tiny little mention, and here's a whole chapter on the same subject. And so, at any rate, the Lucifer Rebellion was a system-level problem. It happened in our system of planets, which is about 1,000 planets. And so it was just a very small part of Michael's kingdom.
Okay.
In as much as it wasn't what you would call a major rebellion in the scale of the universe.
Well, let's look at the delineation of authority. Who was under Michael directly at this point, would you say?
Well, under Michael directly, you would go down to the constellation level.
Well, okay, let's talk.
Get on down to the planetary level.
Right. We have Satania, which was the name of this area, right?
It's the name of the system of planets.
Okay, so Satan was the...
But it had no relationship to the name Satan, the man Satan, in other words. Satania is the name of a system of planets, but it wasn't named after the person known as Satan, whom we now regard as the devil. Mm-hmm. In other words, it'd be just like saying that the state of Georgia was named after your brother because his name is George. There's no connection. But at any rate, Satan was Lucifer's assistant.
Okay, so Lucifer was actually the big guy.
Lucifer was the system sovereign of our system, the system of Satania. In other words, Lucifer was the head, the ruler of that system of planets.
So Satan just happened to have that same name, that's all.
Yeah, right. And Satan was Lucifer's right-hand man. It's like his executive officer, his vice president, so to speak. And we became much more familiar with that name because Satan was the one who traveled around to the various planets to do Lucifer's bidding, to speak for him, so to speak.
Now, Caligastia was the lord of...
The planetary prince, the spiritual leader, the ruler of this planet. All this happened about 350,000 years ago. So
well, that's not long ago.
No, it was before my time.
No, I'm just saying not long ago as far as time is concerned, though. Because
not
we're
in
looking
not
at
in the framework of eternity. It was just
years.
a heartbeat ago.
Yeah, right. All right, I keep jumping around, but unfortunately, it's such a big book.
It's a vast subject.
All right, so we have this particular coup occurred. We don't ever hear about Caligastia, that much that I know of. The Bible doesn't really speak about Caligastia. The Bible does mention Lucifer and certainly mentions Satan, but in different ways. Can you give some illustrations as to how you would do some corresponding between the Bible and the Urantia Book?
The most significant thing about comparing the biblical Satan to the Urantia Satan, or Lucifer, as it were. And we're really talking about Lucifer because he was the one who fomented the rebellion. And if we wanted to call somebody the devil, that would be who we most accurately would pin the title on.
So Satan...
And he was, in fact, a fallen angel. In other words, he was a created spiritual being who went astray after many, many eons of brilliant service.
Well, what was his sin? I mean, what was it that Lucifer did that...
The irony of that is that if you read the Lucifer Manifesto in the Urantia Book, where he is making his case, it sounds an awful lot like, what a lot of people believe right here and now in this country. And that is that the sanctity of the individual takes precedence over the welfare of the brotherhood, in the sense that I, as an individual, have a right to do what I please. For example, let's take the issue of pornography. Now, you'd be hard-pressed...
The free speech issue, that's where we are.
You go right out there and you'd be hard-pressed to find an individual who will say to you, yeah, I think pornography is a good thing, we ought to have more of it, it's really good for our society. Hardly anybody would agree with that.
Right.
But yet we have it all over the place because in our culture we have decided that the right of the individual to produce, manufacture, distribute pornography is a higher right than the right of our society to protect ourselves from its ill effects. And that is, in effect, the Lucifer point of view. And his
now, this is very interesting. So this is in the Lucifer Manifesto, which is actually in this book.
Lucifer basically, first of all, he claimed that God didn't exist. He had never seen God, never met God.
Now, this is a high being,
right,
saying that God doesn't exist.
He claimed that God was made up by the Ancients of Days. Now, the Ancients of Days are the triumvirate that rule over the super universe of Orvonton, which we were a part of. In other words, there are many local universes and a super universe and subdivisions in between. But up at the highest level of the super universe, which there's 7 super universes, which all are around the central universe of Havona, at which the center of is the Isle of Paradise, which of course is where God lives. And so this is not wholly inconsistent with the biblical concept of heaven, but it's just much more complex and much larger.
And much more specific and
much
focused,
more specific and explained in great detail. And so anyway, Lucifer said, well, the Ancients of Days up at the super universe level, who he knew existed because, he had contact with them. He worked for them, basically. They were his superiors after, Michael was his immediate superior. And he knew that Michael was for real because that was his father. Michael created Lucifer. He was a created being, an angel, so to speak. And so he claimed that there was no God, and the Ancients of Days just made up that story to prop up their own power, their own authority.
So when they wanted to have something to say,
they wanted to be able
how did you come up with that? They said, well, we didn't come up with it. God told us.
It comes from upstairs. In other words, the Ancients of Days would say, well, this is the way it's got to be because this is the way God wants it.
Right.
And so Lucifer says, hey, I'm not buying that. There is no God. You guys just want it your way. And I'm out here in Satania and I don't need anybody telling me what to do from upstairs.
I mean, this is perfect.
Very familiar.
Okay,
isn't it?
sure, it's familiar.
And,
this is like the age-old,
somebody asked me once, well, isn't this kind of funny that this story and this book and all that seems to mirror the way things are here on this planet?
Right.
And I said, well, no, what it means is that we mirror the way things are out there.
Right. Well, as above is so below.
Yeah, and so at any rate, Lucifer claimed that God didn't exist and that it was all a big hoax, and that they had no authority to tell him what to do out here in his system. And so what he did was he basically seceded from the Union. He's trying to do what Lithuania is trying to do now. He's trying to unplug from the guys upstairs.
Okay.
And so he sent Satan around to the various planets in his system to try to sell this bill of goods to them. Well, Satan approached the various planetary princes, in other words, the head guy on the various planets.
Right. Of which we are Urantia, one of the planets.
Yeah, we're in the 600s in terms of the number where we fit into the 1,000 planets that are in a system.
Is there anything to do with this number 666? Is this?
I have surmised that might be a distortion of the fact that our planetary number is 606. In other words, this is the 606th planet in the system of Satania, and it would be very easy over a few 100,000 years for that to be misconstrued as 666.
Okay.
But that's speculation. It has nothing to do with what's in the Urantia book. And but at any rate, Satan went to the planets in Lucifer's behalf, and including ours, talked to Caligastia, who was our planetary prince at that time, and said, listen, he told him basically what Lucifer's point of view was, and told him that if he would swear allegiance to Lucifer, buy into his program, then he could be the god of Urantia, meaning that he could set himself up as the sovereign, the end of the line, the god of his planet, and he could teach the people, the individuals on his planet, to worship him, and that he would be absolutely in charge, and he wouldn't have to pass any of the credit or any of the worship upstairs. On his planet, he's in charge, just as long as he's there when Lucifer needs him for something on a system level. And so there were a relative few, I think maybe 29 or so planets out of 1,000 that went along with this, whose planetary prince bought into the rebellion.
So there's probably 29 other books like this
there might,
that tell this side of the story.
There might be. The interesting thing is that the reason that this book was sent to us, presumably, was to bring us out of the quarantine, basically, that we've been in.
Right. Now, that's what we should get to right away. What happened then? Okay, we bought into it. How does God... Did God find out about this, or did this just...
Well, you've got to remember that God is a very busy guy.
Yeah.
And, our traditional religious thinking leads us to believe that this is the only place he's got to keep track of. And then he sits up there watching his TV or something just to keep track of what's happening down here every day.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, his kingdom is much, much more vast than that. And they're, just like in the case of the United States, the president of the United States doesn't know what's happening here
today,
in Santa Barbara
right
now. He has the big picture, but he's got senators and representatives and governors and mayors and all kinds of people between him and us as we sit here. So if something happens that's really significant, he'll get the word. But as far as the day-to-day activities and so forth, it's be impossible for him to know what's going on in every community and every city in the country. And it's pretty much the same with God. He has a tremendous kingdom, and he's got a lot of people working for him.
So did this go to Michael then? Was the Michael who was the one who said, Lucifer, you've gone too far?
That took place much later, because once the rebellion started, what happened is the planet began to polarize. And you had one group over here that was pleading the case of God, and and one group over here led by Caligastia and his subordinates.
Okay, so we have division on the planet itself now.
Right. In other words, there was a great debate that went on for 7 years.
Well, that's not that long.
Back and forth. In Earth time, it was a long time. It'd be just like now. It'd be like us having a 7-year-long presidential campaign.
Okay.
And
so now the people are actually involved.
The people are involved in the sense that they are being asked to make a choice now themselves. Are you going to pay allegiance to Lucifer and buy into the new program, or are you going to stick with the old program and continue to have faith in God and to believe in God?
All right.
And so after this went on for 7 years, pretty much everybody had taken a stand.
Okay.
By then. There weren't a lot of people on the planet at this time, of course, so it's not anywhere near the size that it is now. At any rate, one of the first things that happened once this rebellion broke out was that we were cut off from the rest of the universe, communications-wise.
Now, what about the people that didn't want to go with it? They're cut off too.
Well, yeah, the entire planet was cut off in terms of communication with the rest of the universe,
All right.
and for obvious reasons. What's the first thing that any insurgent group does whenever they take over a government? They seize the means of communication, and the media and so forth.
So did the insurgents, which is Lucifer and Caligastia, they cut off?
No, we were cut off from upstairs. In other words, the best way to prevent this rebellion from spreading to
expanding,
other
right.
planets was to
stop
cut
it.
them off where they can't
nip it in
spread
the
this
bud.
word.
Okay.
Right. And so that's exactly what happened. And were it not for that, you and I would take for granted this stuff about system government and the super universe, because we could turn on the 6 o'clock news and find out what's going on at Salvington, which is the system headquarters, or any other place in the universe, because we would have interplanetary communications.
All right. So the reason that we on Urantia, or let's call it Earth for those of people who are having trouble believing this, the reason that we on Earth right now question the existence of extraterrestrials, have never met extraterrestrials, or know nothing about the rest of the universe is specifically because we've been quarantined.
Right.
Not because it doesn't exist, or not because the rest of the universe isn't interested in us. We are actually not allowed in.
Right.
Okay.
And the interesting thing, sometimes people will say, well, it's been 350,000 years. Why don't they cut us some slack? Well, you got to remember that the 350,000 years in the framework of eternity is just a couple of minutes. And so, as far as the heavenly beings, the higher ups are concerned, this thing just happened last week, and it's still in the process of adjudication. Now, the fact that they have told us the story, vis-a-vis the Urantia book, is an indication that they're ready to start, telling us about this, or they're ready to start bringing us back into the system. And if you'll notice, on our planet right now, all over the planet, with a few exceptions and notable exceptions, the trend is toward peace.
Right.
It's toward global brotherhood.
And unification, right, brotherhood.
And so the planet is getting nearer the point where it should be. See, the Lucifer Rebellion set us back eons in terms of our spiritual development, because it introduced into our planet a erroneous, evil, if you will, alternative to God's point of view, to God's will. And most planets don't have that. All you hear is the good stuff, and people are raised without this competing philosophy, which has resulted in the crime and the pestilence and the wars and all the stuff that we have on this planet, which are not characteristic of a normal planet.
Okay, we've got Lucifer, Satan, Caligastia. We've got them in a little bit of understanding here as to what is going on. The Bible refers to the three of them basically as Satan. So the Bible's in a sense referring to them as a concept. And let's go over the concept again. The concept being nothing more than the idea of
evil. Selfishness.
Selfishness, self-rule.
The idea that the individual is
more important than
the brotherhood. That the individual's rights supersede those of the brotherhood.
Now, when we watch science fiction movies, whenever we see this concept of the brotherhood, it's supposedly scary, namely that everyone does the same thing and everyone lives in harmony and peace, and that is supposedly scary to us because the individual doesn't have the right to think for himself. Is that really the way it is?
No, not at all. It's easy to see how you can get that impression, but the humankind always has the option to choose. to choose good or evil, to choose right or wrong, or to choose the will of God, or to reject the will of God. That's why they call us will creatures, because we have free will, and you're always able to make that choice. And the fact of the matter is that the idea of being concerned about the welfare of your fellow man, and by the way, I'm not a sexist, I'm using these biblical traditional terms to include both men and women, and but the idea that the Brotherhood of Man is an essential part of our culture, that should be an essential part of our culture, is based on the simple concept that if people think of each other as brothers and sisters and regard each other that way, then they tend to get along a lot better, as opposed to thinking only of their own needs, their own self, and what's good for me, never mind what it does to you. And this idea, this selfishness, or this self-orientation, is what precipitates, the major portion of the crime and the hostilities and the wars on the planet. People are concerned about their interests to the exclusion of other people's interests. And this is inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus Christ, and it's inconsistent with basic philosophy, with basic logic. And so a kingdom where you don't have a strong negative influence is not necessarily boring. It's just less troublesome. And on a kingdom, or in a planet, for example, where you haven't had a rebellion, where you don't have the strong influence of the dark side, if I can use a Star Wars, terminology, without the strong influence of the dark side, it doesn't mean that there is a complete absence of evil or wrongdoing. It just means that it's a much more rare thing. And on our planet, it's almost seems like a 50-50 thing, where about half the planet are people that we would not choose to be close to or choose to be around, and the other half are good people. And so it's a much more complex issue than just everybody being the same. Jesus himself said that uniformity is not what we're looking for. We're looking for spiritual unity, meaning unity of purpose and unity of goal, but the diversity of cultures and individuals and taste and so forth is what makes it all interesting.
All right. Michael incarnates as Jesus the Christ.
Well, not Jesus the Christ, and that terminology was added much later.
Jesus of Nazareth. Have the fundamentalists oversimplified what Jesus' teachings were about? Because all I ever hear from them is believe in Jesus as the Savior and everything is all right. I think that's fairly accurate.
Well, to be more accurate, the basis of fundamental Christian religion is original sin and atonement.
All right.
Meaning that man is condemned from the get-go on the basis of the original sin of Adam and Eve, meaning that God is a very vindictive person or something, so that because of the sins of some people that lived thousands of years ago, he's going to condemn their progeny for thousands of years to come, and which is very hard for me to swallow. But anyway, the idea of original sin is what puts us in jeopardy to start with. And then the atonement is the concept that God, got to the point where, well, I'm really tired of condemning my children, and so I better send my only son down here to the planet so they can kill him, and thereby I'll have a means to forgive them. And
so some type of a sacrifice.
Yeah, a sacrificial concept.
All right.
And that Jesus was sent here for the express purpose of being crucified, and would thereby provide atonement for the sins of people who hadn't been born yet.
All right, what was the original sin anyway?
Well,
does anyone know?
The sin of they're referring to the sin of Adam and Eve. And if you want to, I don't want the ladies to come down on me here, but if you go back to the very essence, it's when Eve took the bite out of the apple, which, by the way, is another mythological description of an event that took place, but it didn't involve an apple and it didn't involve a snake. It was a simple...
It didn't even involve a woman.
It did, in fact. It did involve a woman, and it did involve a man as well.
All right.
And Adam, that's another whole story, the Adam and Eve story. They did exist. And as
Well,
some
look,
people...
we've got time. Let's talk about Adam and Eve.
Okay, we'll digress to Adam and Eve a little bit. Now,
This is according to Urantia.
According to Urantia, Adam and Eve were not the first people on this planet by a long shot.
Okay.
And there's a clue to that in the Bible, by the way. In Genesis it talks about, Adam and Eve had their two sons first, Cain and Abel. And then Cain slew Abel.
Okay, so we're down to one man.
And then Cain, according to the scriptures, he went off to the land of Nod and took himself a wife. Now, where did she come from? Okay, now that's a tough situation.
That's a little clue.
That's a clue.
Also, wasn't Cain marked?
Well,
wasn't he a marked man at that point?
Not really. The land of Nod was the home of the Nodites, and the Nodites were the ones who broke off back during the Lucifer Rebellion. If you recall, there was a great debate going on after the Lucifer Rebellion, and the group that chose to reject God and to go along with the Lucifer point of view were led by a man by the name of Nod. And the people, his followers, and later his descendants became known as the Nodites.
So they were the people that went along with...
They went along with the Lucifer Rebellion. They went along with Caligastia, in other words.
So that's where Cain went.
Right. Cain went off to the land of Nod. In other words, the descendants of Nod, who were the guys who sided with Caligastia in the Lucifer Rebellion.
Now, what do the fundamentalists say about this? I mean, here's the land of Nod.
They usually will say they have a lot of different ways of explaining some of these things in the scriptures that don't add up, and they usually amount to just ignoring the problem.
Okay.
And
all right. So I didn't mean to say that, but why don't we continue with?
See, the one thing I would like to say while we're talking about fundamentalists, almost as though it's a dirty word.
Okay. Now, I want to apologize. I'm not in any way taking issue with fundamental doctrines. The thing I'd like to say, though, is that we always hear the one-sided issue. We always hear you either believe in the Bible or you are going to hell. You either accept this doctrine or you're going to hell. And I find that hard to swallow, and I know a lot of other people do, and that's why we're talking about that issue. And the Urantia book is just some way to look at that.
Yeah. I wanted to mention to the fundamentalists, to my fundamentalist brothers and sisters, that the important thing to remember is that we serve the same master. And I've had ongoing discussions, and I've had some pretty intense debates with persons of the fundamentalist belief. And the fact of the matter is that we serve the same master, we serve the same God. I just claim to have some updated information, and the fundamentalist doctrines are based almost entirely, the ones that give us the most trouble anyway, are based almost entirely on the theology of the Apostle Paul. The idea of original sin and atonement are the work of the Apostle Paul. Jesus never taught that. If you look in the New Testament, you won't find any place where Jesus talked about mankind being condemned because of the sins of Adam and Eve. And you won't find any place where he said that my purpose was that God sent me here so that you could crucify me and I will be the sacrifice that saves you from your sins. He never taught that. That's why, if you recall, that's why Nathaniel split from the apostles, because he wanted to teach what Jesus taught. He wanted to teach what Jesus taught them, what Jesus preached in his day. And the apostles wanted to teach about Jesus, the sensational aspects of it. Now, a lot of people don't even realize that the Apostle Paul was not one of the 12. He was a second-generation Christian who didn't know Jesus. Other than the brief encounter on the road to Damascus, the Apostle Paul never heard Jesus preach. He never traveled with him.
Why do we even call him an apostle then?
Well, he was dubbed an apostle much later. on the basis of his missionary work and on the basis of his writings. See, a great many of the books in the New Testament are essentially letters that Paul wrote to the various churches that he established on his missionary tours, who insisted that he provided them with some written explanations to specific questions that they were...
So he was a minister out doing a sermon by letter, and this becomes part of the Bible.
Exactly.
And then this becomes the Word of God.
And I'm going to explain to you why Paul developed the doctrine of original sin and sacrifice. A lot of people say, well, why would somebody make up a story like that? And I wouldn't go so far as to say that Paul made it up. I believe that he believed it to be true, but it was his own deductions that made him arrive at that conclusion. Because here's the situation. Jesus, the leader of this new religion, and by the way, it wasn't Christianity, because the word wasn't coined until long after Jesus was dead. That's what the religion about Jesus is known as Christianity, not the religion of Jesus, the gospel of the kingdom, as it were. And so Paul were it not for Paul, Christianity or this religion about Jesus would have probably died out, because he was largely responsible for keeping it alive. And he was a great man, and a great religious teacher. But he had a twofold problem. First of all, the crucifixion was a terrible public relations disaster for the early Christian movement. Suppose, for example, that you were walking around in a park and some guy comes up to you and says, I'd like for you to join our group here and become a part of this new religion. And he'll say, well, who's in charge of this new religion, or who's the master? And he said, well, his name is Jesus. And he said, oh, you mean that guy that they just crucified up here on Golgotha a few weeks ago? Tried him, the Sanhedrin, our religious leaders tried him and convicted him and sentenced him to death, and now you want me to join his club?
Right.
No thanks. And so Paul was confronted with the public relations problem in the sense that he had to find an explanation for the crucifixion. How is it that some Roman soldiers, at the behest of the Sanhedrin, can crucify the Son of God? Why would God let it happen? Why would Jesus let it happen? I mean, how can this be? Because it just didn't fit into anybody's concept of what the Messiah was going to be about. And the second problem he had was the idea that the Jewish people, and Jesus, of course, was a Jew, and the great majority of the early Christians were Jews. And the Messiah concept that they had been raised on for generations was, in their mind, it was a temporal ruler, a political ruler, somebody that was going to come along and reestablish the throne of David and put the Hebrew nation back on top again after.
So that's what they were looking for.
They were looking for someone who was going to put them back on top in the physical, temporal sense. And Jesus, of course, was a spiritual leader. He had no political ambitions, no military ambitions. He was going to teach them about the kingdom of heaven, which is within you, as he said many times. And so the Jewish people weren't really looking for that kind of a kingdom. They wanted out of bondage. They wanted to be back in charge of their own lives again. And so they weren't too enthusiastic about this religion that involves just a spiritual, philosophical thing. And so in order to sell Christianity to a Jewish nation, to Jewish people, it had to be tailored to, first of all, their long-standing tradition of sacrifice. The Hebrews had been sacrificing animals and calves and all kinds of innocent animals to what they perceived to be a wrathful God for generations and generations. And the idea was that if you killed this animal on the altar, that somehow appeased God, that he was into that. And they were afraid not to do that. And so Paul used the crucifixion as the ultimate sacrifice to end all sacrifices. And now we no longer have to do this anymore. And it also explained why Jesus was killed in the first place to their satisfaction, because he was supposed to be. He was sent here for that purpose. And so at that time, it was a very tidy and a very practical explanation for Jesus' reason for being here and why he was crucified and what it all means to us. But again, it was entirely the creation of the Apostle Paul. And
Now, what about the resurrection?
Well, the resurrection is unrelated to that issue.
I mean, Jesus could not resurrect himself if he hadn't been crucified.
Jesus was resurrected.
Well, no, I'm not saying that Paul made all this up.
No,
I'm just saying.
Paul is the one who came up with the idea, the doctrine of original sin and atonement.
So he came up with
as it relates to Christianity.
We could call it the hole in the script.
Yeah, what he did basically was provide an explanation for a lot of people that needed an explanation,
right.
And one that he believed to be true, and because he was, raised in the same environment, and it all made sense to him at the time, I'm sure. And so the idea that salvation is based upon buying in to this version of what happened and why it happened is what Christianity is now.
Okay.
In other words, you have to accept this story as being the true story if you want to go to heaven. But that's not what Jesus taught.
All right. Now, when did King James put this thing together?
Now, the King James Version of the Bible was printed in 1611. And to give you some background on that, the King James Version of the Bible was based mostly on the Greek text that was edited by a fellow by the name of Beza in 1589, which in turn closely followed the earlier text of Erasmus, who lived, this happened around 1516 to 1535. And Erasmus, in turn, based his work on 8 Greek manuscripts, the earliest of which was a 10th century document. And by the way, this is biblical scholarly work. This has nothing to do, this information didn't come from the Urantia Book. It comes from the biblical studies. Now, it's interesting to note that Beza had 2 very valuable 5th and 6th century manuscripts available when he prepared his text, but he chose not to use them extensively because they differed significantly from the previously published text of Erasmus, which, remember, dated back to about the 10th century.
All right, so what we have happening already is we've got editing going on.
Right.
There's been some information
Editing,
that has been
translating.
excluded.
He has chosen not to use the earlier manuscripts, which he had in his possession, 5th and 6th century documents, because they didn't match up perfectly with the previously published text of Erasmus, which was based on 10th century documents, the oldest thing they had at the time. The reason he didn't use it is because back in those days, if you took issue with the scriptures, you got killed for it. For example, William Tyndale was executed just for having the audacity to translate the scriptures into English so the common man could read them, and he was executed.
Now, when was this? This was
Tyndale. Let me see. I'm not sure. I think that would have been in about the 17th century. Or the 16th, 17th century. I'm not sure exactly.
That's not that long ago. That's why.
No, in fairly recent times.
Was this one of those?
It was much before that. Excuse me, I've got myself confused
right.
here. The King James Version of the Bible, anyway, is based, therefore, on approximately 10th century manuscripts. Now, since King James was published, we have discovered manuscripts that date all the way back to about the 3rd century. And
we've got no place to put them now.
And if you compare the scriptures in these 3rd century documents, which came from the Dead Sea Scrolls and so forth, there are a lot of differences between those documents and the 10th century documents, which King James is based on. And the comparison of those two, we're not talking about a lot of serious fundamental differences, but just a lot of differences in terms of, matters of historical fact, matters of quoting and so forth, various individuals. And the most important thing about it is it proves that the scriptures were in fact altered, either purposely or inadvertently over a period of time. And it makes perfectly good sense whenever you consider the fact that this stuff happened 2,000 years ago, and in the interim, the scriptures have been translated and edited and rewritten, dozens of times. And another important thing to bring to attention is the fact that the New Testament, as we know it today, wasn't assembled in its present form, as a group of books, which we now call the New Testament, until about the 4th century. And so, in other words, the Bible didn't drop out of heaven bound in leather, in its current form. It's an anthology of writings, of religious writings that were created over a period of hundreds and even thousands of years, if you include the Old Testament, and by a lot of different authors.
And so, by all, or I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but it should be an evolving book. It just hasn't. It's stagnated for a while. That's where we are right now.
What has happened is, and this is where the fundamentalism comes into play, is that certain individuals have chosen to base their beliefs on some documents and various books and letters that were written over a broad spectrum of time and by a wide, group of, a diverse group of individuals, and to base their entire belief and their faith on these writings, which have been passed down through generation after generation, rather than the Spirit of truth that Jesus foretold and that God provided at Pentecost for all mankind. And so as a result, they have more or less closed their mind to even the possibility of a new revelation, regardless of what form it comes in. And one of the problems is that in religious circles, the authority of the information always comes before the evaluation of the content. One of the main questions I get about the Urantia book from anybody that I talk to for more than 30 seconds about it is, who wrote it? Where did it come from? And if you're dealing with a religious scholar, the very first thing they want to know is by what authority has this information, been
and meanwhile,
printed?
we're discovering now by what authority has the Bible been.
And so the bottom line is that there's no way to prove today, no way whatsoever to prove who wrote anything in the Bible, and when it was written or where it was written. There's just no way of knowing that.
So we have two things
to take it on faith, just
right.
like you do with the Urantia book. You have
exactly.
To take it on faith.
We have a belief system here that the Bible is a particular document, and as long as we believe that that's the way it stays like that. It's stagnant. It is stagnant, not meaning negative, but just it's stayed.
It's frozen in time.
Okay, frozen in time is a better way of saying it. And yet here we have more information. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have information that's been found from the 3rd century
Which,
AD.
by the way, have been published in the form of, like, for example, the New International Version of the Bible is based to some degree on the earlier manuscripts.
But in no way have we still, at this point, discovered as much as information as we find in the Urantia book. Is that correct?
Oh, so the Urantia book has 777 pages devoted just to the life and teachings of Jesus in great detail. I'm talking about his youth. For example, Jesus had 7 brothers and sisters.
All right, let's talk about that.
Which we never heard about.
Great. Matter of fact, Jesus had brothers and sisters, so he was in a family. Tell us a little bit about him.
Well, Jesus had an upbringing and a family life that was very much like anyone else's in the period. And
so he wasn't the only son of Joseph and Mary.
Oh, no. He was the oldest, but by no means the only one.
So he was the only one at one point.
Yeah.
Okay.
At one point. And Jesus' father, Joseph, was killed in a construction accident when he was 14 years old, and he had to more or less assume the role of the head of the family. And so this had an impact on his upbringing. But before we get too much into that, I want to back up just a little bit. And a while ago we talked about what isn't the key to salvation, in the sense that the idea that believing in original sin and atonement, I suggested that is not the key to everlasting life or to salvation, which of course will bring down the ire of many people, many Christians who believe that it is. But I would like to offer in its place what Jesus taught as being the key to salvation. And because in other words, I don't want to take something away without putting something in its place. And Jesus, in one of his many discussions with his disciples and his apostles and his students, the people that he preached to and taught to. There's many, many of them in the Urantia book, and many of them are quoted verbatim, presumably. And so there's a lot of teaching there, a lot of information. But the best capsulized, the essence of it came whenever he was one time asked this question. And this is what he said. Now, this is a quote from Part 4 of the Urantia Book, The Life and Teachings of Jesus. He said, "Salvation is the free gift of God, but those who are born of the Spirit will immediately begin to show forth the fruits of the Spirit in loving service to their fellow creatures. And the fruits of the divine Spirit, which are yielded in the lives of Spirit-born and God-knowing mortals, are undying hope, loving service, confiding trust, sincere fairness, unselfish devotion, merciful ministry, forgiving tolerance, courageous loyalty, enlightened honesty, unfailing goodness, and enduring peace." Now, to me, it
sounds like vows. Sounds like the vows you would take if you were to become a monk
well, no, not really. They're just basic, goodness.
Right.
And the idea is that, now, in my view, living up to those mandates is much tougher than just believing in original sin and atonement. But on the other hand, it's much more valid philosophically, in the sense that it requires you to do something, to be something, and to demonstrate something rather than just buy into a particular explanation of things. And so those fruits of the Spirit, as Jesus referred to them, is what they expect to see in someone who is Spirit-born and God-knowing. And if you are Spirit-born...
They meaning?
The celestials.
Okay.
The heavenly hosts.
So this is what they expect?
This is what they expect of people that are, in fact, let's call it saved, a term that the fundamentalists are familiar with. If you want to call yourself saved, then I should be able to look at you and see those qualities. And they should be a part of your lifestyle.
So we're not talking about lip service here. We're not
talking about lip service. We're talking about living the religion. And the religion of Jesus was a living religion. It wasn't something that you can crystallize and write down in a book or incorporate into a statue. It's something that was a day-to-day practical approach to living. And that's what Jesus taught. He taught us how to live one day at a time, how to relate to our fellow man, and the kind of character traits that a person will exhibit if they are true followers of Jesus. Now, to me, that's a much more important message than the message that eventually became the foundation of Christianity, the idea that Jesus died for our sins, believe it or perish.
Right.
And that can get you off the hook too easy.
Right. So in other words, you can do anything you want as long as every night before you go to bed you ask Jesus to forgive you for what you just did.
And as long as you believe the story,
Right.
And it's not really that simple.
No.
And most Christians wouldn't agree with that statement, but because they'll say that if you are saved, then you're going to want to do right and to follow the teaching of Jesus, and that's true. That's what Jesus said. If you're Spirit-born and God-knowing, this is what we expect to see in you.
So the question is, how does one become Spirit-born? How does one get the Pentecostal experience?
Well,
I mean, isn't that really the essential question here?
One of the problems is in answering that question. One of the things that gives people, particularly of an intellectual persuasion, a hard time is that they have been led to believe that this has to be an emotional experience, that it has to be a rapture or some kind of a big event, and it all of a sudden comes over you and your life is changed. Well, I'm not questioning the validity of that kind of experience, but that is not really the only way that it happens to people. Now, I had a problem with this because I always was a questioner. I always had a why behind. Every time somebody would tell me something, I'd want to know why. And one of the problems I had with fundamental Christian doctrine was that there was just too many whys that couldn't be answered reasonably. Just that's the way it is. Take it or leave it. Buy into it or else, And I always had a problem with that. And there were a lot of explanations that I couldn't, that no one had for me that I needed to have. And this came to a head one day many years ago. This is also, I'm an ex-policeman, back in my younger days. I was a Dallas police officer, and one of the things I had to do to get that job was to take a lie detector test. And so I'm strapped into this machine, and they're asking me a lot of questions, personal questions, to find out if I was pure enough to be a policeman. In those days, you had to be, pure as the driven snow to be a policeman. At least in Dallas, Texas, you did. And I was asked a question in the course of this polygraph examination: did I believe in God? Now, here I am, the preacher's son, right? And I just very quickly said yes. Just, who are they talking about? You're talking to the preacher's son here. And I said yes, and the machine said I was lying. And that weirded me out, and it really bugged me, that this machine...
Because your body said you had questions.
Basically what it amounted to, excuse me, I came to the conclusion, after thinking about this quite a while, that I wanted to believe in God, but I just didn't really have any hard evidence or anything to sell me on it other than the fact that I wanted it to be true and that I wanted to believe it. And what the Urantia book did for me, it gave me the evidence that I needed. The solid, logical, comprehensive explanation of every question I ever had that nobody else would answer for me. And it's
so everything you want to know about God but were afraid to ask or didn't know the question.
Or couldn't get an answer from.
Right.
And it was full of ahas. You'll be reading along and you come across something and you say, aha, I knew that. I knew that inside, but I just, never saw it put into print, or I've never seen it explained to me before. And I kept coming across these things that my gut feeling, my spirit of truth, as it were, told me that, hey, you're onto it now. Now you're getting the straight dope here. You're getting the skinny on this. And it got to be pretty exciting because you'd read on, and I kept waiting to come to something that would be the key, the clue that this is a hoax, that this is, aha, this can't be true. I know now that this is a big hoax. Well, I just never came across that. I came across a lot of things that were extremely far-fetched, and it seemed so contrived or arbitrary at the time. But by the time I had read through the whole book and really developed an understanding of the big picture, it all fits into place beautifully, to the extent that the big picture concept of the Urantia book is what it's really all about, that it shows you a big picture that just blows your mind. And the most important thing I can say about that is that once you've read the Urantia book extensively and are familiar with its contents, you cease to be concerned about the origin of it, because it stands on its own philosophically. And you realize that, hey, I don't care if this thing was written by a stockbroker in Chicago or God himself, this is good stuff.
It rings true.
It rings true, and if everybody listened to what's here and pattern their lives accordingly, this would be a really great place to be. This planet would be in fine shape. And so its validity, it's self-authenticating. It's philosophically self-validating, once you've read through it. And there are a lot of things in there now that would be very controversial and that would seem very inconsistent with our cultural upbringing, with our current value systems, if taken out of context and if looked at outside of the context of the whole. But in toto, the comprehensive nature of it and the expansive nature of the information is just, enough to keep you busy for a lifetime. It is a lifetime study. You can't pick up the Urantia book and a week later say, okay, I got this all figured out.
All right. Jesus was not the only son of Mary and Joseph.
That's right. And, speaking of his brothers and sisters, one of the most interesting anecdotes is about Jude. Jesus is, I believe, his youngest brother. His name was Jude. And Jude was a hothead. He was a kind of a nationalist type. He was one of the militant type Jews of his period, in that he was very rebellious relative to the Roman soldiers, the Roman centurions, the Roman rulers that they had, that they were subjected to at that point. And Jude had a tendency to get into trouble and to run his mouth off, basically. And there's a very interesting story in there about a time when Jesus had to go to the slammer and try to talk Jude out of jail, and to try to placate the Romans to get him to turn him loose because he had insulted a Roman soldier. And the perhaps the most moving thing about Part 4 of the Urantia book is the humanness of Jesus that is brought out. The human side of him. The Bible focuses on the divine side of Jesus, which is interesting, but not very useful, to you and me who are down here in the trenches. And we need to know how to deal with these day-to-day problems that we have, these day-to-day family crises, and these day-to-day problems with interpersonal relationships. And the life and teachings of Jesus in the Urantia book goes into great detail about his entire life and all of his relationships and all of his teachings, and there's scarcely anything that you could confront in your daily life, any kind of crisis or decision-making process that he didn't face his personal self, that he didn't have to deal with. And it's very helpful to go in there and see what Jesus did when he was in this kind of situation, or what Jesus would have to say about that, because it's always very reassuring, it's very comforting. And it's important that, Jesus is called the way shower. And if he's going to be the way shower, we need to know, how he did it, what his technique was, what his beliefs were.
So how do you get Jude out?
And he just talked him out of it. I won't go into a lot of detail about the specific answer.
And this is actually in the Urantia book.
It's in the Urantia book, of course. And
we have a detailed life of Jesus, starting right out with the birth. The birth isn't even the way that...
No, I was hoping you wouldn't touch on that. Now the Catholics are going to be after me.
Why not?
Well, because according to the Urantia book...
Let's not only have fundamentalists calling today, let's have the Catholics, let's have the Jews call.
Okay, according to the Urantia book, Jesus, the man Jesus, the physical incarnation of Michael of Nebadon, a son of God, was born into this world through the same process that all of us were.
So carnal.
So the virgin birth didn't happen according to these teachings, and if you think about it, there was really no need for that in the first place, other than the fact that there were some people many, many years ago, again, long after the death of Jesus, who decided that it just couldn't possibly be that the Son of God could have come into the earth as a result of an act of sex because of their own personal hang-ups about the sex act at that time. And so that point of view was cultivated to satisfy their own needs regarding
and this wasn't the first story, incidentally, that there had been someone born of a virgin.
Well, this is brought up, the idea of in the scriptures that Mary was a virgin. The earlier transcripts don't use the term virgin. They just say a maiden, which is means something different, in that terminology. But according to the story as it's related in the Urantia book, Joseph and Mary were already married when Jesus was born, and they were indeed having sex like most young married Jewish couples, and like most Jewish couples, they had a lot of children. That was one of the main mandates of the Hebrew people, was to have as many kids as possible, because someday we're coming back. You know? And so they had their 7 or 8 children, and the fact that Mary wasn't a virgin is really
it doesn't lessen the importance of Jesus.
It doesn't change a thing, other than the fact that it's at odds with the Christian.
Right, and we can't
doctrine.
call her the Blessed Virgin if she wasn't a virgin. Not that doesn't make her important.
She's not any less blessed.
We just can't call her the Blessed Virgin now.
And a lot of people can, but at any rate, as I said, that's a touchy subject. And all I can say is that if you want to believe that Mary was a virgin, if it makes you feel better about who Jesus was, then go ahead on. But the fact of the matter is that Jesus is no less important, and his message is no less valid because of the fact that he was conceived his physical body was conceived in the same manner as all other men's physical bodies.
All right, so we've got a complete history of Jesus' childhood. We've got him 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all these years that are completely left out.
Completely left out.
Why? Well, of course, I guess one of the reasons they were left out is because, first of all, the Apostle Paul never met him or didn't know.
Yeah, well, Peter was the one who wrote the first. Well, actually, the first gospel was written under his tutelage by John Mark, and he was familiar somewhat with Jesus' family, and he knew something about it. But it was. And remember, though, this was 40 years after he was dead,
Sure.
and none of the early Christians considered that important. And the idea was that they didn't think that the history of Jesus, or for that matter, his life and teachings, were particularly important, because they thought he was coming right back. He said that I'll be back.
Right.
And to their way of thinking, that meant soon. Like next week, next month, next year, in their lifetime. They weren't thinking, thousands of years. And so they went out there to start telling people about the glorified Christ, and he did these miracles, and he was crucified, and he rose from the dead, and he's going to be back any day now, so you better get your act together. And so they focused on the highlights, the more spectacular aspects of his later life, and didn't consider the details of his childhood and his upbringing relevant to anything, and there wasn't any need to include that. And I might tell you another little story just to give you a sample of the kind of thing that's in there. Jesus, according to him, his greatest temptation, didn't have anything to do with the devil or whatever. But whenever he was a young man, I believe around 20, 21 years old, he had already developed quite a reputation for his grasp of the scriptures, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible at that time. He was very educated. He spoke Greek and Hebrew. He was a musician. He was an excellent carpenter. He was a boat maker. He was just a multi-talented Renaissance man, by all means. And his ability as a teacher, and his grasp, his insight, and his understanding of the law and the Jewish teachings and so forth had created a reputation for him that went all the way to Alexandria.
feel